This question real quick, and I'll give you a couple hints on here. It might help out a little bit more than just looking at it. Um, what I like to do when I'm looking at these types of questions, especially with a couple of different variables, is I usually like to write them out first and then sort of keep track of where they are as the loops are running. So for example, here we've got, if we start first in this line right here, we've got one variable called outer. We have n, which exists also, and then we have later in this line down here, we've got inner. And those are our three variables there. Let me actually space these out a little better. So n, inner, outer. And then we can already sort of see that through the question itself, inner. We can see n has been declared as an integer with a value of 0 or 4, sorry, and so we can set that equal to 4, and then it tells us what needs to be printed as a result. Now, if I didn't already know the answer and I wasn't sort of explaining it in that context, I would probably tell you to first just look at the code and do what I just did, which is essentially just write down some of the variables that you see, skim over. Notice I didn't go line by line and sort of explain through it even in my own words, because the question might be asking you something more specific. It might actually be asking you something more general. So then I looked at the question, and now I can sort of go from there and see, okay, I need to figure out what outer is, because that's what's being printed out here, and that's what the question is asking me to do. So I can go from there. So I'm going to start first with this first for loop. We can see n is already 4, so we know what that is, and we can keep it there. It's never going to change. Outer is initially set out to be 0, and that's just about everything in that first line, so we're good for that first line. The inner one, we can start there for the next one. Inner equals 0, so we set that equal to 0 as well. Inner is less than or equal to outer, and then it'll increment afterwards. So let's take a look. Right now we're in this line right here, and we're trying to decide this statement. We're trying to decide if inner is less than or equal to outer. And we can see here, outer is 0, inner is 0, so that means they are equal, and so this statement is going to be true. So that means that this print statement is actually going to run. So we're going to go ahead and print out outer, which is 0. This is where my output, I'm just going to put it over here. Output. Oof, that's not a good, I meant to draw a square there, but it didn't end up as one. So I printed out 0, and so that's what we've got there. And now a space. I'm just going to ignore that for now. All right. So we're in a for loop. So we just did the code. Now we have to go back up here and we have to increment. So let's increment now inner, and it's now 1. And then we can check again our statement. Is inner less than or equal to outer? So in other words, is 1 less than or equal to 0? And in this case, it's not. So what's going to happen here? That means that this for loop is done. So this loop right here that's inside is done. So any variables that exist just in that for loop are going to be erased, and they no longer exist. So in this case, the only variable that exists just for this for loop is inner, because it's the only one that's being created. It's the only one that says int beforehand. And so I'm going to erase inner. It no longer exists. Whoops, I didn't mean to erase outer. And outer is 0. So this inside loop is done. And now I can go from this part and now loop again the outer for loop, because we can't forget that that one exists already, because it's going up to 4. So now we know, okay, we finished everything inside of that for loop, which in and of itself was also a for loop, and we can increment one more time. So we can increment now outer so that this is 1. Then we can check this again. Is outer less than n? 1 is less than 4, so we're good to go. And now we go inside of the for loop once again to this line right here. And so we create the for loop again, which in creating the other for loop or running the inner for loop, we create inner once again. We set it equal to 0. and we can start our check again. We can see, all right, is inner less than or equal to outer? Is 0 less than or equal to 1? In which case it is. So now it's going to go inside and print out what outer is, which in this case outer is 1. Now that we've done everything inside of the for loop, we're going to loop again, and we're going to increment inner. Now we're checking, is inner less than or equal to outer? So it's 1 less than or equal to 1, in which case it is. So again, we're going to go inside of the for loop, and we're going to print 1, and then we're going to cross out the 1, and we're going to do 2, because again, we're looping that inner for loop. And now we're checking, is 2 less than or equal to 1, in which case it is not, and it's not true. And so in that case, our inner for loop is now done. And so we can do the same process again. We can take away inner because it no longer exists because that inner for loop just stopped running. Now, if you want to keep going with this, you can pause the video here and sort of try it out yourself and figure it out from there. But I'm going to keep going through the rest of the answer if you want to come back to it after and check your answer there. So now my outer, since we just finished the actual code inside of that loop, which again was a loop itself, I'm going to take away 1, and I'm going to increment it by 1, and it's now 2. Is 2 less than 4? It is. So now I'm going to do the inner part of that loop, which is the other for loop, and I'm going to again create inner and start it at 0. And now this loop inside is going to be looping up to 2 because that's what this statement is saying here. So that means 0 up to and including 2. So I'm not going to go through each iteration again, but just know if we're going from 0 to 2 including 2, we're running 3 times. 0, 1, 2. So that means we're going to print out outer, which is 2, 3 times. So 2, 2, 2. And that means inner is running 0, then it does 1, then it does 2, then it does 3, but 3 is no longer less than or equal to 2, in this case up here again. And so now we stop this loop, erase it again, because our inner loop is now done. And now we can increment outer one more time to be 3. Erase some of this over here. Okay, and then we do the same process. Now outer 3 is less than 4 still, which is this check right here. We go inside of that for loop in that case because it is true. Now we're going to check, or we're going to run the for loop again. So now we're going to do inner, set it equal to 0. Now we're looping up to 3, including 3 because it's less than or equal to. So that means inner is going to be 0. It's going to print out 3 because it's printing out outer. Inner is going to increment to be 1, which is less than or equal to 3. So we're going to print out 3 again. Inner is going to be 2, less than or equal to 3. So we're going to print out 3 again. Now it's going to be 3. It's still equal to 3. So we're going to print out 3 again. And now we're going to get to 4. 4 is no longer less than or equal to outer, which is 3. So now our loop inside is done. We can erase this stuff. And now we can increment outer one more time up here. So now outer is 4. And last, we're going to check here. Is 4 less than 4? It's no longer less than 4. So that means this is no longer true. And that means our outer loop is done. And we are good to go. So our final result here is 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3. And let me double check what the which option that was. 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. So that would be D. D would be the correct answer in this case. Awesome. All right. I hope this was helpful. If not, feel free to let me know, and I'd be happy to sort of walk you through any of the points that I glossed over. But again, hope this was helpful.